Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Sprite Tropical remix of Extreme Metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka Addicted to Neovaginal Skin, Cannibal Corpse, Judith Butler, and the radical queering of death metal.
Well, coming soon to a university conference room near
I was about to say, has it just been written already?
Yeah, that's probably like page 356 of the Hunter Hunt Hendrix manifesto. But and I am the black metal guy, aka conceived through an anal rim shot.
Oh, those link up pretty well, actually.
Yeah.
You see,
I thought I might have already used that one, but then I realized probably not.
Well, black metal guy, I didn't know that you too were so interested in radically queering extreme metal. That's good.
Yeah, that's the basic goal of this podcast. Is what we've been about all along.
We're pivoting dramatically, but not pivoting at all at the same time. All right, guys, this is our second episode of the week after our special on a particularly gnomish Burzum recording. But now we are back to your regularly scheduled programming, so we're going to get into it without much delay. But because I keep forgetting, and I only do this every fourth episode or so now, feel free to follow us on social media. Me, the Death Metal Guy, on Facebook, at Terminus Podcast. Black Metal Guy on Instagram, at Terminus Extreme Metal. And feel free to subscribe to us on Patreon, where $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, where you too can debate what is more powerful in the Terminus audience, book reading or forklift certification.
This is Josh from Defeated Sanity, and you're listening to Terminus Extreme Metal Podcast.
All right, we are back, continuing kind of a streak of high-profile releases that we've been covering. We gotta do a nice 2020 style episode at one point with just some tapes that no one's heard. But today we are going to be covering the, I believe, 7th full-length record by Ulcerate, titled Cutting the Throat of God, out now on, is it Debemur, Morti? I believe we talked about this before.
Morti. Yeah, What We Owe to the Dead.
Yeah, over on Debemur, Morti. So, Ulcerate essentially needs no introduction at this point. New Zealand, sort of avant-garde death metal band is what some people call them. Really just sort of the launch pad for disso death in a big way. Pulling in influences from orthodox black metal, from post-rock, from various other genres. Everything is Fire back in 2009 was the big Flashpoint record, and it is, I would say, pretty much objectively a great and very important and unquestionably highly influential record. I have dabbled in Ulcerate a little bit over the years, just listening to a track here and there, not really following the band's progression, but Everything is Fire is, of course, a semi-legendary record for a reason. And it is influential to the point where Ulcerate's influence has essentially seeped into extreme metal as a whole. I don't think that we can really argue that they have not been very significant and have not, in no small part, sort of sculpted the current landscape of extreme metal with the success of that record and, probably the ensuing ones that I'm less familiar with.
Yeah, I thought Shrines of Paralysis was good. It had basically the same, same basic formula as Everything is Fire, but it introduced a lot more sort of expressiveness to it, which is maybe an odd thing to think of when you think of the early Ulcerate records, which were very anti-expressive. But you get some more sort of like bending lyrical guitar lines. And maybe it gets easier to hear the similarities between the things in post-rock they're into or the aspects of black metal that interest them. And I think that's definitely the angle they have continued up through this record. But yeah, that early Ulcerate is great. And now that we've established that, we're about to shit all over this record.
Yes, we are. Which is interesting because I didn't really dislike this record, not like actively when I first heard it, but as we talked about it more and as I thought about it more, I started to gently sip upon a little cup of haterade that rapidly progressed into an undiluted liter of the stuff. And here we are.
We've sort of drank ourselves into a feeding frenzy.
So, Ulcerate at this point, where do we begin? Ulcerate is a band who I think is an example of what happens when... So you're in a band. You attain a sort of wild, surprising success out of nowhere. You start paying attention to what fans and critics are saying, and what they hone in on is the most auspiciously unusual part of your sound. Everything is Fire as a record owes a lot to certainly stuff on, some of the more cutting edge of traditional death metal, like Immolation. Mm-hmm. But in large part, it is very firmly a death metal record, first and foremost. At this point in the band's career, Cutting the Throat of God is a record composed almost exclusively of the most out elements, the elements that are drawn from other genres of music, to the point where this thing's status as a death metal record, or I would argue even like really a metal record, is pretty in question. And I maybe this is how I start. So I listened to about half of this record a few weeks ago before we had decided to cover it, and my reaction that I expressed to the black metal guy was, yeah, it's like basically good, but who gives a shit? Ulcerate at this point has almost entered the echelon of like really big, widely accessible extreme metal bands, but the audience that it's cultivated, they don't seem to be the kind of people that are listening to Cannibal Corpse. They seem to be the kind of people that are very eager to put any of this band's records at the top of their yearly lists on Rate Your Music. It is appealing to a sort of not quite sophisticated enough to be a hipster record collector.
Well, wait, before we start insulting the fans, which I mean we definitely need to. What about the sort of the broader stylistic thing you were telling me about how influential this band has been? Like the thing you were saying about what happens when you come up with an avant-garde sound and then just stay with it.
Yeah, well, so a couple things happen there. One, as I said before, you start to fixate on the most avant-garde parts of the sound, but then something else happens. Ulcerate, as I said, their influence is so substantially felt across extreme metal now that listening to Ulcerate do their Ulcerate thing has become agonizingly fucking tiring to experience. All the beats are exactly where you expect them to be. Certain signatures of Ulcerate sound, sort of through no fault of their own, are incredibly fucking irritating to me at this point, simply because I have heard them executed by so many imitating bands over the past 15 years that even the original article upsets my tummy. It's like, and that's like, sort of like, I can't necessarily blame the band itself for that, but we have been, over the past decade and a half, experiencing such a fucking deluge of these wandering, textured riffs and this sort of like
glimmering or chiming guitar arpeggios.
Yeah, man, and it's just, I don't fucking care anymore. And it Everything is Fire was a great record because it was so out of step with everything around it, and it had a large amount of novelty to it. Now, we shit on novelty for novelty's sake on this show all the time, but it does have a purpose. To create new things, you have to do new things periodically, and sometimes that involves throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. And it happened for Ulcerate that on Everything is Fire, most of it stuck pretty well. But the problem is it stuck too well, and now those elements are just part of the vocabulary of extreme metal, and they probably never should have been. They probably should have stayed with a very small contingent of bands operating in this style, but now it's gotten everywhere. Ulcerate is one of the preeminent examples of what was basically a very good band that has had enormously deleterious effects on the genre around it.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a funny thing, right, where you start out with, you come up with this sound that's highly distinctive, and like you said, has a genuine good newness to it, but then you start sort of iterating on it with a Motorhead-like consistency. And maybe sometimes that would work, but there's an important difference of type, right? Motorhead is a folk band, fundamentally. Or at least Motorhead kind of invented extreme metal and then sat back on the rock and roll element of their music, the sort of folk aspect, right? Motorhead is sort of music for, it's totally fine for a band like that to release a bunch of records that aren't very good but have a few great singles on them once every few years. Ulcerate, it's weird because you make your reputation by doing something very, by making a big sort of technical leap forward in a style and opening up some new emotional territory, and then you kind of hang out there while everyone else catches up with you. I think that's kind of this thing you're describing, right? Ulcerate, everyone else has successfully absorbed their sound while Ulcerate have sort of stayed still.
Yeah, they have accidentally become part of the herd by just occupying the same space, and everything filled in around them.
Yes, I think that's true. And part of the problem, of course, is the this is just a case of, in a way, the formula gets stale. But on another level, there's just problems with the formula. If you want to find out why this happened, you have to look back at, what was it about the concept of the band originally? And I think it has to do with novelty. Basically, this band emerges out of the, there's some very funny YouTube comments on this, on the official release of this record.
Funny is a way you could describe them.
Yes, okay, but one that's actually sort of accurate, at least, and useful is, imagine listening to Immolation, Neurosis, and Deathspell Omega, and saying to yourself, yup, we can do all three of these at once, and pulling it off flawlessly for 6 albums straight. Now, nothing is incorrect about that statement. And if you wanted to describe what was so cool about the earlier Ulcerate, or even the sort of the more lyrical stuff like Shrines of Paralysis, that would be a pretty good way of doing it. But there's something odd here, right? This is essentially a band that has decided to be very arty and progressive by imitating 3 other bands that are very known for being arty and progressive and idiosyncratic. And in that sense, they're drawing from a shallow well. This is that problem. This record, Ulcerate, might be a little too concerned with novelty or musical progress. It is, at the beginning, you could trace the roots back to death metal. At this point, especially through, Immolation explores a lot of similar territory emotionally and in terms of tempo and all sorts of things, but Immolation is definitely a death metal band. And you could hear that, the traces of that in the early Ulcerate stuff. But as that death metal part has dropped out of the equation, you're left with this. There's no rooting in the origin here. They're not tapped into well springs of tradition in any of the genres they're drawing on. It's an attempt to, what if I combined all the most progressive sounding bands in all their different genres? Then surely we would have the most progressive band ever.
Yeah.
And in a sense, they were really talented musicians, and they pulled it off, right? You're not wrong to listen to those three bands and hear potential angles for connecting them, right? Mm-hmm. And in a way, all those three bands were getting at something, a form that had yet to quite crystallize, and Ulcerate identified it and brought it into the world, okay? That's fine. That's a cool thing for a band to do. But it means there's not a really long shelf life on it if your three primary if your main job is sort of completing a process carried out by major bands of the just prior generation or even the same generation, then that's all you've done. Mm-hmm. Right? Which is a worthy thing to do and a cool thing to do. But like, also it distilled this thing that was in the ether, and now what are you going to do with it? Right.
Well, I think one of the problems is that like the whole utility of Ulcerate's musical process was like to develop new vocabulary, new technical features that other bands could draw influence from and use, and it's done that. And now that that's done, we're left with just the songs themselves, and some of the blush has come off that rose. Once you are past the general conceit of this music, it doesn't have a lot in the way of like substantial content, at least not in the way that we want from a heavy metal record. When you were talking about Ulcerate pulling away from death metal, what you get is a massive void in the middle. Nothing has rushed in to fill the sort of structural riff by riff form of this music. This is an album that sounds like it is composed of endless fucking bridges and unearned climaxes in the worst excesses of post-rock.
Yes. This really, and this record really, unfortunately on this record, they really kind of, these problems would have emerged over time, no matter what, I think. But on this record, they really commit to all the sort of frailest aspects of their sound. And so one thing that's weird about this is almost all lower mid-tempo sections that almost groove but don't.
Mm-hmm. Well, they would not allow themselves to groove. God.
Right.
What do you think this is? A fucking rock and roll band? This is art, black metal guy.
Yes, that's a recurring theme throughout this record. Sort of flirting with a certain idea that would have a tangible interest to it, and then pulling back because it has to be art. And like the whole concept before was, what if we took this relatively well-established kind of art rock riffing that we're getting from various sources, Neurosis, Immolation, post-metal, post-rock like Mogwai, Godspeed, post-punk. You take all that and you apply it at blistering tempo and intensity with maximum, with down-tuned guitars, growling vocals, and sort of hideous rhythmic complexity, right? That would be death metal, right? And it was cool hearing all these ideas presented in more sort of sprawling or pensive modes being delivered in this maximalist and crushing, really heavy way. This record is not heavy.
No, it is not.
Of course, you can be heavy at mid-tempo. Right? You can sound huge at mid-tempo, but this record doesn't. And without that, this certainly isn't death metal, and it becomes just a pastiche of other elements that they deemed to be progressive in the progressive bands before them. And what you end up with is something like Tool with growling.
Yeah.
And without the grooves.
Well, I mean, to that point, what we're seeing is, I've advanced this sort of thesis that the whole point of extreme metal is this crashing juxtaposition of high art and low art. And this record, to me, is what happens when people become self-conscious and try to jettison all the low art. Tool...
Exactly.
Tool is a cool band because it has high art aspirations, but it's also just like cool stoner music. You know, there's groove parts. There's a rock and roll band living at the center of Tool. Ulcerate at this point has nothing living at the center of it. It's nothing but, you know, these aesthetic gestures that are getting mashed together. Like the primary riffing on this record, in the most auspiciously extreme metal parts, is sort of nothing. You know, there's no real desire to establish like major melodic themes, not in, you know, the blast beat sections, not in the more extreme sections. All of that creative energy is reserved for like the parts that imitate Opeth or Tool. And you can tell that, like, the question at this point is, like, why is Ulcerate even aping extreme metal if that's not what they want to do? Well, I think that it has to do with retaining an audience of people that, I will argue, think they're into death metal, but really aren't that into fucking death metal. You know?
And also, for better and worse, extreme metal has sort of inherited the mantle of artistic legitimacy from these other genres, right? I mean, like, there's a, like, to the extent that anybody listens to rock anymore, they listen to metal. So, like, there is basically no viable version for Ulcerate that is not an extreme metal band.
Yeah. There's no place for it to land.
Yeah, I mean, there are people, like, the closest thing to, like, rock that people are listening to is nu metal, right? Yes, exactly. No place to land. Right, there's not, like, it's not like you can come back to the Tool audience.
No, certainly not.
And Tool have had similar problems over their career in that they released a series of great records, and arguably strong records even after Lateralis. I thought 10,000 Days was underrated. But they just, after a certain point, they just keep sounding like Tool records that sound like Lateralis and are more diffuse.
Yeah,
and you can listen to it and be like, "Damn, these guys are really good." But it's kind of weird to hear basically the riff to Schism on the record they put out 3 or 4 years ago. I'm like, what?
Yeah. Well, the problem for Tool was they sort of reached an apex of creative potential with Lateralis, and then all they could do was repeat Lateralis, which is pretty much one for one what's happened to Ulcerate.
Well, on that note, I guess let's get to the let's chop this bitch up.
Let's do it. We both sampled off of the track Transfiguration In and Out of Worlds, which I find interesting.
Yeah, okay, and there's a crazy thing, there's a very funny thing going on here, actually, which is, when I went to put in my sample, like, we listen to the music, and then when we hear something good, usually we're like, we pause it, and we, like, run over to the computer and mark down a note or whatever, right? So, I got to the end of a really good section, and I went to notate it, and I was like, I stopped the recording right at 25:32. Which is right where your sample started.
Yes.
So, insofar as there's a center of gravity on this record, a lot of the action happens on this track and in the following about 4 minutes of music. Basically, what I would say is there's, kind of as with Tool, there's a really great goth band hiding somewhere in here. Maybe in Tool it's actually more overt, but there are some, I actually do think there are some beautiful melodies on this record, but they're the moment, or textures maybe, phrases, but they're the moments that come closest to just 80s goth. The very beginning of the album feels like that, and this part feels like that. So why don't we get into it? Okay, so at the end you start to hear the riff sort of dilate and turn into like a preparatory to a trem riff or something. But basically we start out with this kind of, reverent bell-like arpeggio guitars, very generally gothy, maybe almost something like The Cure. And then we get to the really heavy part, which kicks in about a minute in, which is more like a lead or maybe like a 2-string chord or something. It switches, so it's like switching between lead and slight chording. But it has this very hot, distorted tone, and he's bending it a lot. And it's like a Joy Division riff, or I could name a couple other bands like And Also the Trees, Christian Death, all have moments like this where they like let the lead guitar cut loose and play in a really aggressive way. That kind of like scythes through the music. And there, I would argue that that's probably the heaviest moment on the record. I mean, personal taste, of course, but like that part there's a fully defined melody that has a weird, it has some of the formal strangeness, the fractured quality that Ulcerate has, while also having an underlying continuity. It sounds like a goth riff, but weird in a way that only a band with death metal chops could make it. And they work it through a couple of cool variations, and it's really heavy. And the vocals sound good over it. It's right there. The music comes together in like a headbangy way, I would say. And it has ironically, it's where they sound most like a mid-tempo 80s art rock band, that they sound most visceral.
Yeah. Well, because that's the center of gravity for the music.
Yeah. And so when they commit to it, it's good. But very often they don't. Within like the first or with the second or third track, there's a moment where they set up a part like this. They like introduce a really cool melody, and then once the drums lock in and you get the part, it's been sort of like moved up a half step and torn apart. Right? It's been ulcerated, man. And of course, that riff is just way worse than the riff before.
Well, black metal guy, haven't you heard? High art is all about unrealized potential and frustrating the audience.
Yeah.
like, why would we, want to make a cool thing? What are you, 12?
Right, why would we achieve when we can strive? And reflect on the hopelessness of striving.
It really is about the journey, man. You'll learn that when you're older. Okay, so picking up where you left off, let's get to where the song, I was about to say falls apart, but it doesn't fall apart. It just treads water. There's a lot of water treading on this record. So we've expressed on the show a lot of times that extreme metal thrives off a certain level of homogeneity, especially within a record. That is not necessarily a problem in and of itself. But Ulcerate really does all sound the same. I do not believe I could pick one track on this album from another, because they are all composed out of basically prefabricated Ulcerate gestures chopped up and rearranged. And this next section of this same song hits a bunch of those beats. So you're going to have the really textured harmonic stuff that leads you to believe that something more complicated is going on, when fundamentally most of these riffs are based off of two alternating minor chords. And you're just sort of playing around those two pillars with obviously related notation. You'll have the part where Jamie St. Murat does blast beat where blast beat don't go, which was really cool and enthralling 15 years ago, but now it's just oh, he's doing the blast beat over the riff that shouldn't have a blast beat. This is fucking art. And at the end, you're going to have a big, shiny, melodic Pelican riff, which is actually a very good riff, but it's better on a Pelican record. there we go. A bunch of shit happened. I mean, none of it, like, really did anything, but it did essentially outline the established gesture of the post-rock climax. And that's kind of what this album relies on continuously, are these awkwardly framed, really drawn-out setups for climactic moments that almost always revolve around a sort of post-rock melodic gesture. I've got some patience for that, probably more than you do, but it becomes extremely obvious within 2 tracks of this record that that's the basic structure that this entire thing is going to conform to.
I liked that last riff, the thing you called the Pelican riff. First of all, I do hear the Pelican comparison. Second, it is better on Pelican records. But that is a good riff. You know, and they hint at that riff at the very beginning of the sample, or at a riff like it. We were listening to it, and just as the sample starts, as the riff I was sampling sort of turns around, it then threatens to become a very cool arpeggiated blast riff, and they're like, "Whoa, none of that."
Oh yeah, no, right. They can't let it happen. There's this, one of the nice things about extreme metal is the principle of why don't we just do the cool thing? You know,
that's the whole thing that made it different from metal.
We've suggested that it's like, that extreme metal's evolution is pretty much based off of finding the most extreme and cool parts of traditional heavy speed power metal, what have you, and being like, well, yeah, but why don't we just do that all the time? That's everyone's favorite part. Ulcerate can't let themselves do that. And I think, maybe this is projection or something, but there really is a sort of like art guy credibility issue there. Like, if we concede to these pleasing normative gestures, we are, injuring our status as forward thinkers.
But then the other thing is they end up back at a pleasing normative gesture anywhere that this has substance. It's just not a metal one.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like they back themselves up into the equivalent of the extreme metal do the cool thing gesture, just imported from other styles of music.
Right. You can either affirm and bravely go to your cliche and make it your destiny, or you can end up in a worse cliche by accident.
Yeah, it's truly bizarre, and this is really a case of a band that is playing to its audience. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because they didn't used to do this. I mean, the old stuff is an exercise to some degree. One of the things that makes it cool is why not just do the cool thing? Okay, you hear. Why not just play these post-rock riffs, but make it an inscrutable vortex of cosmic hurricane, right? The old stuff is it's not like it's difficult and confrontational, but it's not its satisfaction is that you can windmill headbang to it continuously, right?
Early Ulcerate is still lightly brushed with like the oceanic war metal scene.
I was actually gonna suggest that. Yeah, that if it had any link to more ancient forms, it would be something like that. Yeah. But yeah, man, it's rough here. It's rough on this record.
Yeah, it's really this is a record where there are things constantly happening, but they all end up being less than the sum of their parts.
Yeah. So let's go to another sample. So this is actually, we're doing a little bit of shit out of order here. This is Undyne as an apparition, and I'm just starting it from the beginning. This is the second to last track. Basically what this is the deferred climax to the previous track, To See Death Just Once, which the death metal guy's about to sample. But we're going to start out with another one of these big post-rock moments that you could easily compare to something like Pelican, as the death metal guy said, or maybe Godspeed, You Black Emperor.
Thank God they immediately shut everything down and went to another, like, misty, clean guitar passage.
For sure, it was getting a little much for me.
Yeah, there were, like, things were happening. Yeah, something that I've noticed is, Ulcerate on this record does something appreciable, which is the sort of, like, shepherd's tone, perpetually rising intensity thing. But the problem is, like, once they've gotten to the big chiming lead riff over all the, like, messy stuff underneath, they don't have anywhere to go beyond that. And they use that technique over and over again, so really all they can do is, like, stop and start the whole thing over again.
Yeah, and so, yeah, that's exactly what happened there. And that big chiming lead riff, I mean, I hate to be kind of a one-riff pony or whatever, but this is Screamo. Right? I mean, that just, like, if you take those kinds of guitars and put them over blast beats, you get something that sounds like Orchid or Gospel or Buried Inside or something. And which isn't bad. It sounds really pretty cool. But then it's definitely not death metal, and then it fizzles out. And what's gone missing in all this is, the funny thing is, people will still refer to this as disso death. The dominant harmonic quality throughout this is pretty straightforward, sort of consonant minor scale stuff. Like, it's the harmonies. Ulcerate used to be very, very dissonant. Now that's been reduced to more like spice on more straightforward kind of mournful minor scale riffing. It's much more consonant, and that's part of the other thing that's changed. Ulcerate used to be appealing. Part of the initial appeal to art people was Ulcerate was difficult to listen to in a way that was also appealing to metal people. Right? It was, in fact, really loud and flattening and sort of monolithic and extremely dissonant. Right? Even the cool melodies were deeply fucked. At this point, now that they've brought this more sort of gossamer, poignant aspect into their sound, it's kind of taken everything over. And maybe almost without the band noticing, because so many of the basic arpeggio and so many of the techniques are the same. But it's sort of like slowly the bass harmonies of the band have changed a lot.
Yeah.
And it's lost a lot of its edge.
Well, to your point, so rewinding slightly to the screamo thing, which and this is an idea that sort of permeates all the like extra metal influence on the record. There's like adequate kind of screamo style riffing on this, but the reason listening to Orchid is so much better than this is because Orchid is energetic and alive and like in the moment of that music and emotionally vulnerable. Ulcerate gestures toward being like emotional and atmospheric, but they will not allow the veneer of professionalism and art world aspirations to fall. You know, what makes good screamo good is the unhinged, naked rawness of it, and those are adjectives that Ulcerate will never allow to be applied to their music. So while they can take the melodic gestures from that style of music, they basically ignore the entire sort of like human context that it emerges from.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. And, you know, by that same token, Orchid is more aggressive than this.
Yes, far more
Way
aggressive.
more aggressive. You know, what is it? Sends him home on a stretcher, brah.
Yeah. I mean, Orchid's fucking awesome. Or, you know, even more to the point, another screamo band that's extremely influential on metal, which is Page 99, which flattens this record. You know?
Yeah. I mean, the closest thing would be something like Buried Inside, which is pretty metal for screamo. It's more sort of cold, but again, like it just operates at a much higher level of intensity than this, in part because they allow these arpeggio phrases to build and do the cool thing.
Yeah. No, exactly, and that's the sort of hidden thread between screamo and extreme metal is this propensity towards conscious, deliberate indulgence.
Yeah. So yeah, this is I like what you said though about the faint towards emotion but lack of emotion sets up your next sample really well.
That was the idea. I've been doing the show for years.
Well, I see you, bro.
It's good to be seen. And speaking of seeing, to see death just once, not multiple times, a provocative title makes you think. If orthodox black metal has the spooky arpeggio void, Ulcerate has the plaintive clean guitar part with intricate ghost note drumming.
Isn't that a spooky arpeggio void?
Basically, yeah, but Jamie St. Murat is better than basically every orthodox black metal drummer.
Fair enough, yes.
So shit on a bunch. Obviously, all of these guys are outstanding musicians. Jamie in particular is probably just like one of the best drummers in metal and probably like music at large. He's incredibly strong. All the performances are outstanding. No shade to throw there. The problem is that, like I said before, the plaintive clean guitar part is like a prefabricated thing that occurs in every fucking track. And I guess the question is, when does something go from an established part of a band's style, a sort of stylistic marker, to just something they're chucking in there because they feel like they need to? And more importantly, what is it supposed to indicate to the listener? Okay, so here we are, another plaintive clean guitar part, ending in another basically like post-rock climax. And here's my primary issue at this point. A lot of people talk about, this record being like stirring and atmospheric and emotional, and I really want to I really want to sit some of the people saying that down. I want them to tell me directly what that emotion is or what that atmosphere is. Because to me, this sounds like music with a lot of markers of the idea of being emotional or atmospheric, but it's real fast and loose with the details. And moreover, this leads me to the big question. What is Ulcerate about? Why is this called Cutting the Throat of God? Is this an anti-religious record? Well, the lyrics don't really suggest that, at least not directly. The music doesn't really suggest that it's about anything in particular, apart from a sort of latent metal idea of being epic or being big or vast. There's a lot of gestures on this record that, they reach toward significance, but they're completely unwilling to be pinned down into a meaningful statement. And as a result, this music comes off as, and this is a word we don't really like to use on the podcast, pretentious nonsense.
Yes. So their last album was called, bring it up here, Stare into Death and Be Still. What
okay.
that means roughly is look at a thing that you can't comprehend and say nothing about it.
Cool.
In other words, it is blankly pointing at a blank there and making that the significant gesture. Now, obviously, there's a value to meditating on death and finality and the absoluteness of things, and that is, but that's just every single good metal record ever. Mm-hmm. And there are certainly Funeral Doom and Funeral Doom bands or DSBM bands that do it with more profundity, and in a way where they have something to say about death. This is just standing and pointing at it. Death isn't it really big? And in that sense, it's fixating on death and decay and futility, and taking that as an object of a kind of pseudo-religious reverence, right? You can look at death and, well, death is really big. It's really sort of ultimate and hard to describe. Maybe death is the most powerful thing in the universe, man. And what you end up with is in a way, there's a healthy impulse being expressed here, and that there's a longing for reverence of a kind, but it's deliberately stepping back from all the concrete options for reverence in black and death metal, which are, childish, goofy, offensive, whatever, and settling on something that is just generically ominous and generically and conveniently big and undefined. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have much to say. And if you read through the lyrics, I don't think we need to waste too much time on them, but there's a similar just morass of one negation on the next, negation heaped on negation.
You know what? I just found the perfect way to phrase it. The lyrics on this record are just like the music. It's really heavy on adjectives and really short on nouns. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with a record that I am actually very excited to talk about. Been a while for this band, but they are near and dear to my heart. We are talking about the new Malignancy record titled Discontinued, out now on Willowtip Records. Malignancy is a really cool band. I don't have the opportunity to talk about them very much on the show because their style is kind of singular. And while I think they have been really influential in the more technical edge of brutal death metal, it's really hard to draw comparisons immediately between them and really any other band. Malignancy have a very long career, over 30 years at this point, and they have just consistently moved from strength to strength. Partially because I think they have a lot of quality control on their output. Discontinued is only the 4th full-length record by the band, if we're not counting the re-recording of Intrauterine Cannibalism back in 2019 for the 20th anniversary of that record. And apart from that, their history is dotted with little EPs of original material, not just sort of bonus track content, but really fully realized pieces in and of themselves. And all of it's excellent. There's certainly records that I prefer to others, but I don't think they've ever released a weak record. What makes Malignancy different? Well, we'll talk about some of the musical aspects, but I think something really illuminating is actually an experience that I had with the band. I've seen Malignancy live a couple of times, and the first time I think was around probably 2007, back when I was a teenager. I was really excited to see them at my local metal venue. So I was hanging out, and I got to talking to the guys from the band. And, for the record, incredibly cool guys, very funny and smart, and they really like to talk about music in a very serious way. There's plenty of cool guys in death metal bands, but a lot of them don't really want to have super in-depth musical chats, but these guys really do. So I ended up talking to Ron Kachnik, my apologies if I'm mispronouncing his last name, who's technically not the original guitarist, but is basically the central guitarist for the band since 95. And we were just talking about music a little bit, and me as a teenager, I just mentioned that I was really into Devourment. And what Ron said was really interesting. He said, yeah, man, Devourment's a really cool band. I like them a lot. It's great mosh music, but it's just not the kind of thing you can, smoke weed and listen to under the headphones, which strikes me as a really interesting way to evaluate it, because, smoking weed and listening to Devourment under headphones is something that I have done many, many times over the course of my life. But he had a very different view of it, that it was a very different kind of experience than what he was doing. And not just in a stylistic sense, but that the objective was very different. And this suggests something interesting about Malignancy as a band. Malignancy are a band who see the challenge of playing this music as part of the joy of it, and in a sense the challenge of listening to it as part of the joy of it. The guys in Malignancy have been in various bands, some of them, much simpler than Malignancy on a technical level, but it seems that they find a real joy, and maybe they were one of the earlier bands to find real joy in the idea of brutal death metal as a sort of athletic, personal boundary pushing project. They're a band very invested in always outdoing themselves in technicality and extremity. And they just, there is no sense that the technicality of Malignancy is to impress anyone or to be flashy. It's purely for the joy of playing. And I think that really comes out in their music, which, while really grotesque and extreme and weird and mutated, always has this palpable sense of youthful enthusiasm and playfulness, which I find really charming and really sets them well apart from pretty much anybody else in the same style. So that's the basic background. Black metal guy, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume this is your first Malignancy record. What's your initial take?
Yeah, almost certainly my first. It's definitely my first Malignancy record, although this is the kind of shit that I would have heard on college radio when I was a kid, just hearing death metal for the first time. Mm-hmm. Well, it is. It's absolutely dizzying. It's hard to get your hooks in. It is obnoxious and inscrutable. But it is extremely rewarding to decipher. The contrast with Ulcerate is pretty illustrative, right? I mean, one of the things we sort of forgot to mention with Ulcerate is part of the death metal lineage there is probably tech death, right? In addition to immolation, right? Whatever sort of tech death was big in the early 2000s. And tracing that style to its root here, you just hear something as opposed to the sort of po-faced self-seriousness in Ulcerate, right? These guys definitely have fun. The music often verges on wackiness, I think, in some of the scales they use and these little sort of exclamation point runs.
Yeah.
You almost get sort of like, you almost get like the Roadrunner dropping the anvil, whatever. But
you can tell that there's like musical inside jokes between the guys playing.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we never get into like Devin Townsend territory where it's not believable as metal or where it detracts from the seriousness of the music. The wackiness is genuinely alienating in a way that contributes to the heaviness, but it's also hilarious, and to an extent, the listener is in on the joke. Defeated Sanity also has a sense of fun in their playing, and I know there's been some lineup overlap, and Malignancy initially influenced them, but the Defeated Sanity sense of fun is a little more like a musician's joke, whereas this is more of a ha-ha bro musician's joke.
Yeah. This definitely has a sort of like
Malignancy is a little more down to party.
Yeah, this has like freewheeling stoner energy to it. You know?
Yes, for sure.
But a kind of stoner that like almost doesn't exist anymore. The guy who gets really high and gets very absorbed into some sort of hyper-technical pursuit. You know, the guy in the 2000s when this sort of thing wasn't so accessible, who was smoking a bunch of weed and coding his own game, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. I do. I think this is, it's not obviously not my day-to-day go-to, but I like this. I think it's cool. I'm glad I listened to it.
Yeah. This is a really fun record. All of Malignancy's work is excellent, and they've actually progressed as a band, and the records do sound distinctly different from each other while all being recognizably Malignancy. If you want something a little bit more down-to-earth, but still with a lot of the same spastic technicality, you can listen to Intrauterine Cannibalism, their first record, which is just an outstanding album that came out in, 98, 99, a really dark time for death metal in general. And that's one of the hidden gems of that era. Although, I think that when we talk about the late 90s, early 2000s, we're getting into territory, it's sort of like the Dark Ages. Maybe we're revising our opinions on that, because a lot of great stuff came out in that period, and maybe it wasn't quite as creatively infertile as a lot of people have suggested. So another thing that I really like about Malignancy is that musically and thematically they have a very distinct angle. Obviously they are a death metal band, they're into gore, they're into monsters, stuff like that, but the tact they've taken has always been a little bit different. Early Malignancy tends to be about disease. It tends to be about nature going wrong. Just the album title, Intrauterine Cannibalism, is about a rare but real thing that can occur. Malignancy is fascinated by sort of bizarre, rare diseases and cancers and stuff like that. But then things start to shift over the course of the career. If the first album is about, nature destroying itself, Malignancy sort of runs that thread backward and wants to explore why is nature destroying itself. And as the band has progressed, they've gotten more and more distinct about the sort of the thematic underpinnings of this music, which is that it is humans destroying things. And now a lot of Malignancy dwells on the idea of biological or environmental catastrophe that erupts out of human error, especially and very pointedly in an endless search for progress and improvement, and the sort of destructive potential that has on the world around us and on humans themselves. We'll get more into that, but I think that it's very interesting how pointed it is, especially Malignancy's lyrics are actually great, and I think Malignant Future, their 3-track EP from 2016, is a great example of that. Like it's done in under 10 minutes, but it really is exploring a lot of interesting ideas about where they saw culture in 2016.
Contagious psychosis. There you go.
Exactly. We could say that on this EP, and really across Malignancy's later discography, they are very interested in a concept that a funny math man came up with at one point called over-socialization. So, with that being said, Discontinued is awesome. It is impossibly technical. It is strikingly memorable, despite the sort of difficult to grasp, slippery music that's being played. And I think that's because Malignancy is interested in really writing songs in a more traditional manner. All sorts of crazy riffs will be played, bizarre time signatures will be used, but they're generally arranged in blocks of 2 and 4. They want the listener to follow this, and they want the listener to establish their favorite parts of these songs. So with that, case in point, I want to start with the sort of lead single of the record, which is called Purity of Purpose. Which it's very obvious why this was chosen, because the moment you hear that opening riff, you know everything that this band is about. What a freakish fucking main riff this song has. Those big slashing cock rock chords into this like dizzying technical arrangement of like sweep picking and pinch harmonics dotted everywhere. It's so cool. Then we're getting into this sort of groovy territory, almost like Chaos AD era Sepultura, but again, way more technical. And then into all the dizzying blast beat arrangements. it goes without saying the technical performances on this record are off the charts. Mike Heller on drums is anybody who's really into extreme metal drumming is going to know that name. Mike Heller at this point is I would say is in a large part a studio drummer. He works with a lot of bands and has his own recording studio, but Malignancy is one of his primary loves that he actively tours with, and his performance is utterly gorked across the whole thing. Obviously, guitar, bass, utterly phenomenal performances, technically perfect, and having seen them live a few times, yes, everything is note for note flawless when they recreate these in the live environment. There's no trickery here. I guess the thing that I would really want to address is that, I like Malignancy's music because it sounds mutated. It's they like to play around with melodic or rhythmic ideas that are sort of intuitive, and then to play with them and warp them in bizarre ways until they're unrecognizable. Almost like a sort of death metal interpretation of the French black metal sour note at the end of the phrase, Like that main riff. We start with something that's immediately appreciable. It's almost like a Springsteen thing, and then bang, they just utterly destroy it. But then they loop that riff a few times. They want these striking melodic moments to actually stick in your head. It's not a sort of indecipherable blur in the new standard elite manner. And one thing that I think is also interesting is that on this record, Danny Nelson, the vocalist, is really kind of pulled back a little bit on his vocal style. It's a lot more of a traditional death growl, when earlier work tended to be oriented around more brutal death gurgling. And I think that's because he really wants the lyrics to be very audible. Here on Purity of Purpose, again, sort of reinforcing the theme of the band at this point, we go, gifted minds nourish theories of morality, improvements that foster unnecessary change, belief in a cause to nurture progress, creation of things that should not be, spliced together to debilitate, lethal combinations develop a deadly strain, sifting through the primordial ooze to conjure new life, re-engineer the natural order, which I think is... it has to be about COVID and the lab leak.
I was going to say, sounds like some unauthorized gain-of-function research.
Exactly, which is funny because they've been talking about things like that well before the pandemic.
Right. And that's one thing I really like about this record, is this sort of... as you say, there is something in the things they were paying attention to in the 90s about biotechnological control and mass surveillance paranoia. These are now on everyone's lips, right? Mm-hmm. Even on the lips of the people who aren't paying attention. And there's an interesting lineage there. Back to before all the silliness of the various protest movements of the last however many years, and before Occupy Wall Street, right, with its sort of a voluntary impotence. You had actually cool shit like the No WTO protests, which united people ranging from crust punks to young Alex Jones. Right?
Yeah.
And tackled all sorts of issues about biotech and actually globalization in a pretty cool way, and actually caused some serious inconvenience to the powers that be. So you could really hear Malignancy carrying on that kind of legacy here. And the fifth track, Ancillary Biorhythms, starts with a very cool sample that basically sums up their worldview regarding these things. And, about this sort of production of monstrosity in pursuit of progress. We're gonna skip past this. I wanted to originally get the sample, but then there was so much cool shit happening after it. I figured I'll just let you guys discover that on the record, and we'll get into the riffs. So, that was a lot of things happening.
Yeah.
But if we wanted to sort of characterize it, one of the core elements of this song and of a lot of the songs on this record is what you could call those Morbid Angel pyramid riffs of like stacking blocks of chords being periodically descending to the root and then another big block of chords rising, and this happening tremolo picked over, fast double bass and blast beats. And there's a lot of very Morbid Angel sounding stuff throughout this record, just with the edges sharpened even more and the technicality upped, which I'm sure is one reason you love it.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And so we run through this sort of Morbid Angel step pyramid, and then suddenly we're in a breakdown that you don't realize is a breakdown until halfway through because of how they introduce it.
Yeah.
There often aren't, like, mosh calls on this record. Like, you don't have the traditional setup gestures you get in hardcore or hardcore-based NYDM or whatever. You're just in it, and suddenly you realize, oh, wait, this is actually a kind of groovy throwdown riff. And then we go into another one of these. They crank up another one of these Morbid Angel riffs and let it go. And then it starts to get into this like 5/4 type stuff that sounds like all the typical reference points, like Thellohun Genjit from King Crimson, or like Take 5 by Dave Brubeck or whatever, right? As corny as that is, right? Da, 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 da. Or wait, am I thinking of Blue Rondo a la Turk? One of those. It's more like Blue Rondo. That's the whitest fucking jazz ever, but there you go. It's a good song.
Well, that's interesting that you bring up the 5/4 thing, because the way Malignancy likes to play with their weird time signatures is kind of interesting. Because something you'll notice, it had never really occurred to me until like listening to this now, is that there's lots of weird time signatures on Malignancy stuff, but they tend to be extended past 4/4, not shortened. And that's because it seems that most of these riffs are constructed primarily as a 4/4 phrase with an odd sort of extension at the end, like a sustained pinch harmonic or a little run that pushes it just past the bar, which gives you that really nice whiplash effect when they restart the riff for their repetitions. And I think this is because they still want this to be like essentially like moshable music. You've got a basic sort of 4/4 underpinning that is accentuated by the weird time signatures. It doesn't really demolish it, Yeah, for sure. You can still find the pulse in it. So they basically set up this sort of pulse riff and then start throwing in weirder and weirder chords in it, and you get more of that bright major chording in it, to the point where it starts to sound like you took an Argoslant riff and sped it up by 2 times. Yeah. Well,
I
think that something that's important to know, I have no reason to, I have no information backing this, but I get the sense that Malignancy are probably one of the rare tech death bands that writes primarily by jamming. A lot of tech death is sort of like deliberately sterile and is also probably produced by, a guitarist or 2 guitarists working together and bringing it to the rest of the band. Malignancy always feels very live and immediate in the way these songs are structured. I imagine there's a lot of fooling around in a practice space.
And the idea of writing these songs by jamming is so daunting. I see what you mean.
Yeah, you just need to be unbelievably top-tier musicians, and then it all just kind of comes out easily.
Cool, can you come up with a riff for that one? Okay, sort of like... Okay, that's one riff.
But yeah, that's very fair. However, like a lot of these riffs you'll see are based off of kind of like conventional idiomatic gestures on guitar.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of jugga jugga. There's a lot of like, if you break some of the riffs down, like you said, you can hear Chaos AD or like Pantera.
Yeah, this is very like technical death metal in the original sense, which is like traditional death metal sped up, made more dense, and with some weird time signatures sprinkled in. It lacks the sort of like advanced thrash metal quality of a lot of other tech death. This is still really rooted in traditional death metal in a way that a lot of other bands aren't.
I still hear a thrashiness to it, I think, because of the constant motion between those higher things and the palm mutes. But I also hear what you mean. It just, Psychroptic really sounds like a kind of mystical thrash band, whereas this does not.
Yeah, that's more the distinction.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
This sounds like thrash metal only to the extent that Morbid Angel sounds a bit like thrash metal.
I get that.
Like, yeah. So I think that's I was gonna quibble on that point, and then I realized, like, nah, I get it. Like, this is a very, the thrashing that is, there's a lot of thrashing done here, but in a very death metal way, in a much more angular and vertical kind of and complex way. Well, before we go further, I gotta ask you that pesky question, death metal guy. Why does it sound like this? Like, I feel like there's, Defeated Sanity is like about as good a comparison for this as you're going to get, right, for a band. And one thing I enjoy about them is that they have this chthonic low-end sound to them. They're playing stuff that's kind of this complex, but doing it with a tone you would normally associate with, like, you know, Death Doom or Slam or something.
Yeah.
Or, not Slam, Death Doom, or, like, you know, really nasty, brutal death metal. This is much more sort of mid and high oriented. I hear there's sort of a cutting edge in the tone. It doesn't sound as sterile as some of the other bands that do this, but it definitely has a bit of that scalpel sound. Why, given how many viscerally satisfying mosh parts and big riffs there are in this, why make it sound so clinical? I
Wilkins
guess agrees with me.
Yeah, Wilkins is very enthusiastic. He's staring at a corner, perceiving into a reality we can only imagine.
No, he's listening to Ulcerate.
Oh, God, no, not my cat. Anyway, this is a Slam household. One, I don't think that I would really characterize the sound as sterile. Like, this is very live sounding to me. Yes, Wilkins agrees with me now. So, get out of there. What are you doing?
Okay, the performance is extremely live sounding. I'm wondering more about the guitar tone. It's kind of like, it's thinner than I would like.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably just a matter of really wanting the listener to be able to hear every note. Defeated Sanity sounds awesome for what they do, but certainly some of the intricacies can get lost there. And Malignancy, as a band, is one that actually trades pretty heavily in sort of dynamics in a very traditional sense. Mike Heller does a lot of kind of tricky ghost note patterns in a lot of his drumming, and I think that if there is a balance to strike between clarity and heaviness, Malignancy tend to choose clarity. Because I think that just sort of appreciating every note, being able to absorb the whole of the music without a layer of distortion and interpretation between it and the listener, rather, is like an important aspect to them. So I understand what you mean, but I kind of like that they sound like this, a little bit more mid and treble heavy. I think it's another thing that helps to separate them from other bands.
I get it. It's part of the genre. I do like this sound a lot better than comparable sort of cleanly produced tech death sounds. For sure. I do like it more, and I also understand it's part of the fact that it might fall somewhat harshly on my ear, which is used to a different kind of harsh production. Well, that's fine. That is the genre-specific difficulty, right?
Yeah.
So fair enough. I just thought I'd throw that out there.
That's fair.
So, on to my next sample. rather than cutting the throat of God, we've got decomposing divinity. Dad?
Yes, son.
Was that a Cryptopsy riff?
Definitely could be. Definitely from their like mid to later work, like Whisper Supremacy onward. Yeah, certainly. I mean, it wouldn't shock me at all if these guys were big fans.
No, well, so what I'm referring to is not the sort of mosh part at the end, right? But the fast part leading into that. Those kind of like needling, those sort of like over the faster bit there. It's way stripped back in relative to the rest of the record, right? They're focusing on two or three note trem phrases, and that to me reminded me of those kinds of simple sort of shepherd's tone things that we listened to on None So Vile a long time ago.
Oh yeah, I mean definitely, and probably even more definitively on the very first record, Blasphemy Made Flesh, which is like largely composed of riffs like that.
Right, because you could listen to this part and be like, oh, that's like the black metal part, but no, it's like a Cryptopsy part, and the vocal performance over it is astounding. I really like these vocals. I can hear how they used to be inhales, but are now much more like growls or roars. And the sort of the more retching tone he gets there is awesome, and the way he does these like drawn out almost groans, like really aggressive groans.
Yeah, Danny's performance is a lot more dynamic and theatrical than a lot of death metal vocalists. I like that a lot.
Yeah, he's like he's as technical as the rest of the band.
It's a suitably weird and dynamic vocal performance to fit the music. Someone less capable would probably do something a lot less interesting.
But yeah, so overall, I like this track because it is it generally sticks into more straightforward 4/4 grooves, so it's pretty driving. And the moments where they modify it the modifications are easy to follow. It has one sort of, that sample we had has one kind of big illegible section in the middle, but that's just fun. And it Yeah, it's propulsive in a way I enjoy, and I thought that sort of cryptopsy type horror death metal part was very cool. And this is a track about whereas Ulcerate was tracks about the death of God that sort of was about sort of languishing in nebulous malaise. These are tracks about the death. This is a track about the death of God that's about being fucking sick, man.
Well, possibly, but like what I got out of the snatches of the lyrics is that it's more about the death of the spiritual death of humanity. The idea, it's like you got a couple of the lines in there: loss of identity, fictional avatars. From what I was able to glean, the full lyrics aren't online yet, but this strikes me as another part in this chapter, another chapter in this record about mankind sort of dissolving in its perpetual quest towards scientific progress, the dissolution of the human animal and the things that make it unique.
Right, everything that's divine in human life or life being put under the being put on the dissecting table of the technological understanding of being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is pretty. Which I think that's what high-minded death metal themes sound like, a little bit more than just sort of passive nihilism or nihilism.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's so what you're. Yeah, it's the song is actually about something, and it has an idea about the death of God and why it's happening and what that means, and so there's a huge. I mean, this is just. I think, listeners can draw their own conclusions. I'm kind of making this pretty obvious.
Yeah. So, last one. We're going to go to Oppositional Defiance. This is one of my favorite tracks on the album. I just really love this one. This is one that I'm going to play because I like the riffs. I like the small army of pinch harmonics. And I like, again, how Danny's vocals kind of slide and slither around the music in really unusual arrangements. It's just really good fun. The difference between today's two albums, under the official Ulcerate YouTube video, somebody said, after 10 listens, I believe I've come to the determination that this is one of the greatest musical works of all time. Under the official Malignancy video, someone says, "Damn, I think I'm pregnant."